I'm Kelly Stevens, and this podcast will be on the contiguity principle. So, according to dictionary.com, the word contiguous means bordering or indirect contact to something. For a psychological view of that, it means that this concept helps with making associations. Clark and Mayer say that this principle has the same effect if used correctly in e-learning. So they are saying that text and graphics or media should be in the same proximity, often next to each other, in order to help the learner create an association between the two in his or her mind. For example, if the graphic is a diagram where words are referring to the actual part of a graphic on screen, the word should be placed near the part that is being described with a line or an arrow to show exactly where it is. So why is it important? So this is an example basically of what not to do, right? So this is a graphic of a Google menu, and there's sort of a legend, right? So there's a 1, a 2, and a 3 above each graphic. And then at the bottom of the screen, there is the words telling what each of those graphics are. Clark and Mayer say this is not the right way to do this because what happens is the learner has to pull their eyes away from the graphic and search out the text that goes with it at the bottom, right? And then read the text and move back to the graphic. Clark and Mayer call this split attention, and it leads to an extraneous load on the brain during the session. So what they suggest is something more like this. So the text is then placed near the corresponding graphic. So the Get Shareable link is right next to that link, and there's a line right there. Same with share and remove. So the learner's eyes stay in with the graphic because the text is in the general area, and they don't have to split their attention to learn what each of those graphics are. This allows the learner to make a connection between the word and the graphic, start making associations, which will help with retention and memory. So, where else can the contiguity principle apply? So, some of the things that Clark and Mayer said in the chapter were that instead of text on the bottom of step-by-step graphics, so if you have different shots of a process, you should have the text that describes the action near the part of the graphic described connected with a line, or they suggest using a mouse over that appears when the mouse touches that part of the graphic. So sort of like a pop-up window. They do say one of the drawbacks of that is that the text disappears once the mouse moves away. So depending on the type of learning you want the student to do, that might not always be the best way, but it is an option that you can certainly look at. Instead of separate screens for directions, activities, and questions or feedback, they suggest, and this kind of reminded me of when you have to flip back and forth between pages where there's a diagram on one page and text on the other, or questions on one page and the answers on the other. So they suggest putting the directions in a small box on the activity screen that can be moved or made smaller, or for questions, have the questions appear on one screen, right? And the next screen with the learners answered with the correct answers marked so that the learner is getting feedback on the questions that they answered correctly or incorrectly without having to look back and see what they answered or what the questions were. Another aspect they talked about were scrolling screens where text or graphics may disappear. And this causes, again, the reader or learner to have to scroll back up, see the graphic, then back down to the text. So again, it leads to that split attention. So they said to try a fixed screen with text embedded in the graphic, or again, the mouse over or pop-up text boxes to not add to the cognitive load of the learner. And they also talked about linking a page where you open the page and it covers the information the student was reading. If you're going to link to an external website, what Clark and Mayer suggests is that you set the link to open in a new window that can pop up, be minimized and moved around so both sets of information can be seen. Whatever the link was, and then whatever text or graphic you have on the main screen of the page. They also talked about audio and graphics. So they said a similar principle would apply to a voiceover, right? So if you have graphics and you're doing a voiceover to add to the e-learning, those graphics and the audio should be presented at the same time. Again, separating them leads to cognitive overload, and the learner loses the ability to make associations, and this affects their long-term learning. Per Clark and Mayer, when presented separately, the learner has to hold the words in working memory until the graphic shows up on the screen. If you time it so that the audio and the text or the graphic go up at the same time, the learner can make that connection. Some of the benefits of the contiguity principle are that the integration of text and graphics equals the ability to make connections and associations. And we know from the learning theories that that's really important. Learners need to be able to make connections in order to retain and really learn the information. They cited a study by Urhal and Jamet of a heart diagram, and they said that people learned better when the text popped up next to the corresponding part it described. So there was a picture of a heart, and there were lines and text pointing directly to each part instead of a legend on the side where the learner didn't have to look back and forth. So they believe that this principle leads to meaningful learning. They also say that there is consistent evidence that people learn best when the words describing an element or event are spoken at the same time that the animation or video or illustration depicts the element or event on the screen. Some of those things that they mentioned, that Clark and Mayer mentioned to watch out for, some of the concerns, and there's still research being done on this, was how many words are too many words, how many are too few words, and does the principle still apply when the verbal message is brief? Maybe if it's one or two words, maybe it doesn't matter as much. So those are questions or concerns that they signaled should be looked out for. So as an example, I pulled some of the presentations that I have done for staff development. And so this was an example that I found that before even knowing what the contiguity principle was, I had done a presentation on Common Lit for the staff, and I had shown them the menu bar, and instead of doing a legend, I actually had the text and lines pointing to what each icon of that menu meant. So you can see that their eyes don't really have to travel to the top or bottom of the page. All of the information is surrounding the graphic, and that allows the learner to make connections. For this one, this was a screencast that I had made to have them log into our information system, and I had screenshots of where needed to be clicked and then text to clarify near the graphic. Now, as I looked at this when I was working on this, I would have, to improve this slide, I would have a link to real time in a pop-up window that could be moved around so the directions could be seen at the same time as the slide that shows them how to log in. And that is a wrap-up of the contiguity principle.